welcome to another edition of the Frontend Coffee Break, a podcast where we take a break from everyday life, grab a cup of coffee or whatever is your preferred drink at the moment that you're listening to us, and just discuss different topics, all front-end related. As always, I have with me Mr. Don Ricard.
Oh
Hello.
man, so polite, so nice. Please continue to do so. Hello, everybody.
And I am Chucho. We're both senior front-end developers at Cognizant NetCentric. And well, today we have an interesting topic that, curiously enough, well, it is related to some discussions that we had recently, 2 days ago. I think it was not even 2 days ago in the Slack channel, in the front-end Slack channel, when they started talking, if I'm not, well, chatting, if I'm not mistaken, about some best practices and this kind of stuff. And the topic of documentation came up. It's like it's always. I think it's always a little bit of a hot topic. There are a lot of people that have different opinions regarding on well, not only on how to document, but if you should document. And in today's episode, we'll talk a little bit about this documentation and to talk about one of the available tools, JSDoc. And you're more of an expert than me in JSDoc. I've used it from time to time, but you are heavily using it in your project, right?
I am, yes, definitely a follow up from the TypeScript episode a while back. What was it? Episode, you guys help me out here. Episode 4. Why
4.
TypeScript? Yeah.
Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about documentation. One thing that I'd like to talk before saying in the different types of documentation, because there's more heavy oriented, light oriented documentation, is it important to document and why? What is your opinion in general terms on is documenting your code important or not?
Yes, no doubt. So a short answer, yes, please document your code. Long answer, don't overdo it. Choose where to document and all those things. Now we're gonna deep dive into, but I think for like big projects, you really need documentation, not only like on the code, but also functional documentation, specifications on how this works, what to expect. So all teams can know what's going on, right? I mean, and I love when I see my code that is a one-to-one to the specification on a Confluence page or public wiki or whatever it is. I can check my code and it's a one-to-one match. That's fantastic.
Well, one of the things that I learned early while in the career, and it stuck to me even today, and I looked for it just to make sure that it's true, is the amount of time that we spend on coding versus the amount of time that we spend on doing maintenance. Well, not coding, but new code versus maintenance. Originally, I remember that, and it stuck to me that the around 60 or 80% of the life cycle of a software was mostly was maintainable,
Oh, wow.
maintaining. Yeah,
Okay.
but that was like, well, I remember the documentation said that, and while I look for it again, it says, well, in the old waterfall approach and all these kind of things. But I'm sure, or I wouldn't be surprised that a great amount of time it is poured or dedicated to maintenance. So I think that this is one of the most important things to take into account. And also looking for statistics, it seems that around 50%, 40% of the time of some developers is spent on doing maintenance more than doing new code. So I think that documentation is important because we spend a lot of time doing maintenance, and to make your code easier to maintain, documentation, I think, is paramount. Now,
Yes, Chucho. But how about, I mean, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, but what if I'm in the same project? Let's say I'm the solo developer or I've never changed projects. And of course, I do new features, but I also do, as you say, maintenance of defects and all components. Why would I need documentation if I already know the code base, I already know how it works or how it's supposed to work?
well, I think that there's two reasons. One of them is that because we never know what's going to happen tomorrow. Whether you get changed to another project, you get additional people, more support, or you just don't want to do this project anymore for whatever it happens. So, and you are not taking into account. I don't know if this has happened to you. Have you ever written code that you take that after years or after a long time you go back and look at it and you say, what the heck was I thinking? Was I supposed to do here? I mean, it happens to me a lot. Seeing old code. I mean, right now, code that I worked a couple of years ago that people are currently working with, they call me, "Hey, Chucho, could you give us a hand with this code?" And then you take a look at the code a little bit, and it takes a little bit of time to remember what you were writing. So if you are documenting the code correctly, or not correctly, but if you have at least a certain level of documentation, it's going to be easier. I don't know if this is if you have
Yes.
a counterpoint on this,
No, no,
or
no, no, no. I mean, you got me there. Definitely, it has happened to me. The same as if I look at the code, I don't know, a year old code, and I see, what is this piece of and then I see the
Mm-mm.
git blame, and it's me, it's my code. So
I love this. Then I go angrily to git blame someone, and I see it's me.
it's me exactly. No, but I get you. I mean, we shouldn't have to be like maintainers of old projects. If we already documented it correctly and we've followed all the best practices, the code should be self-explanatory, and they don't have to call me. I mean, I'm not dependent anymore on that project. That should be the goal.
Yeah, and although it is true that sometimes it's going to be something super complex that might be something that it's not easy, even if it's documented, it's not easy to understand. They might call you, but the important thing is to minimize this. Now, there's one thing that I think we don't take into account when we're working on creating our code, and is that you might think that the person that is going to maintain the code has your level, but that is not necessarily true. That's even possibly not even even if it's close to your level, it's not going to be the same level. I'm saying this because we think that, oh yeah, I'm gonna document the code in such a way, or I'm gonna work with the code in such a way that it's any seasoned developer is going to understand it. Well, guess what? A lot of the developers out there that are going to work with that code are not necessarily seasoned developers. We get a lot of junior developers, for example, or add projects constantly. And if you do code that it's going to be very complex at that level, it might frustrate them, or they might just make their work less effective. So this is, I think, one of the things that we don't take into account is that we code for other people, and we code for other people that don't necessarily have to have our same level.
Yeah, I agree. You shouldn't have to like you don't have to. You don't have to assume, or you cannot assume that everybody knows or the context or what you're talking about. So if you can just link to more stuff, or okay, learn more here, or go there if you need more, then I mean just expand and not like assuming that people know what you know, right?
Now, regarding on how to document, I there's two ways to document, or these two, I guess I would say two tendencies that I know of. One of them is to create self-documented code, which means basically to give meaningful names to variables, meaningful names to functions, in order to not to avoid having to write down this function does this function does that. I
Okay,
don't know if this
yeah,
is
yeah, definitely. I was going to ask you to give me an example of functions that are what you wouldn't approve on a pull request, right? So if you get, okay, let's say I write a function that says get items. What would you think?
what. Well, I don't know. It's what items. Even if it's inside context, in a context, you would need to first of all you would need to see the context. Like, okay, what are we talking about? What type of items? That would be the first thing. And even so, it's like get items. So I would expect that the function would return a array. Okay, that an array of with items. What type of items? I don't know. So what type of items are we talking about?
That definitely. So then that's already like the problem, right? If you go to a pull request, you don't know the code to the context. You should be able to understand what's going on, even with a one-liner. So I would say, for instance, get notifications or get users or get whatever it is, right? So should you please write long function names. Don't worry. If they're long, it's fine. So if you have a build system, probably you have. If you don't, maybe you should. The code will be minified in the end to production. So even if you write, okay, get users with less than 18 years in the system, it's a long, long name, but it helps you understand. And it doesn't matter because in the end, when you minify this thing, it's going to be a function called a or n or z. So it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and it's sometimes just a matter. I think you should just sit down and take a little bit of time, saying, okay, so what is this function doing? How can I just in a one-liner write a good name? I would say don't do 100 characters name, but in a good descriptive name, how could I say what the function is doing? If you need additional information, you can always put a comment, on top of the function, which I usually don't do, But if I find that the function is too complex or that there's things that you need to take into account, I usually add some comment at the top of the function. I don't know, how do you feel about this?
I do when the logic is not clear, right? So if, for instance, like, okay, I have if something equals something, I don't write it in like in English saying if the user is more than 18, no, because it's the same, right? So my comment and the actual if clause will be the same thing. But when it's not something that easily understandable, or that depends on something else, maybe a different file, or some sort of logic, business logic that you don't know just reading the code, then I add a comment explaining or linking to a documentation, right?
Oh well, this is something that I've seen sometimes now that you mention it, and I do it very rarely because I don't need to do it, which is linking to documentation. I don't know, it's not something that happens often, but for example, some functions, especially if it's a solution that I found on the web, like on Stack Overflow or somewhere else, I usually add in those cases, the link to the place that where I found the solution. Especially, it's like, okay, I'm gonna give a little bit of context because you find a lot of information in those pages. So it's like, okay, if you want to look at it, here you go. And sometimes because I don't use exactly the same solution, you take the solution, you fix it up a little bit, and then you work it. But this is something that it's maybe not obvious, but adding a link to the place where you find the source is not a bad thing.
I mean, it depends also on your project. I mean, in my case, we're lucky enough to have the consultants who write very, very detailed specifications with, diagram flows and user journeys. And I think it helps you if you are, I don't know, in a login authentication function to understand the flow, how the users get there, to just link to the diagram, because of course you will not write the diagram again into the code base. You already have maintained in a Confluence or external wiki, something else. So just link it, and yeah, it's free, man. It's a comment, doesn't take you.
And- okay, now question. We have, I mean, this is sometimes when we talk about comments and documents, we think about JavaScript and that's it. But this is not the only thing that needs to be commented. What do you think about that?
True, true, true. I even comment sometimes HTML and CSS. Right? I mean, CSS, how it's like kind of magic, because sometimes, I mean, out of context, it's very hard to know what's going on. Like if you see, for instance, I don't know, display whatever display flags with some sort of alignment, and then you see a translate there and some sort of properties that, of course, you know what they are, but you don't know in what context what's happening, right? So sometimes I think, okay, I'm adding this z index, or I'm adding this opacity because, or if it's a hack, of course, when it's a hack, like I need this for Firefox or for the new IE, also known as Safari. If you need it for those, just add a comment saying, hey, we add this here because Safari, or we add this here because Firefox. But yeah. I don't do it like, okay, you already mentioned JavaScript, so I don't use like JSDoc or things like to create style guides from CSS, but regular comments, yes. How about you?
Well, I do precisely what you said. Well, I do it for two reasons. I add comments in order to separate sometimes in blocks the style sheet, because I need to separate it logically. Like, okay, this is the part of this part, this is that part. Although usually you have different files for each part, but when everything needs to be together, I try to, if it's too complex, to add just separation, just to visually help out. And the other thing, I think that CSS specifically, I mostly document when I'm doing something that when you see it, you just go like, what the heck is this? Why is this here? Why do I have like the color twice? Which could be, why do I have this other instruction that shouldn't be here normally? And it's like, because of Safari, I don't know, or because of this or because of that. But yeah, I think that this is very valuable, especially when you start adding things that don't make sense when you see them, to give a little bit of context, say, hey, well, this is the reason why we have this here. And HTML, it's not very common unless, well, especially if you're working with templates, or in our case that we have Sightly. If I see that the template is very complex, I try to also add a little bit of information. Okay, this is where this block of the template starts. This is where this block of the template starts. In the end, it's not going to be delivered, and it's going to make the code more maintainable. My mantra is to make the first thing you need to do is to make the code as maintainable as possible. Nobody's going to give you a price to make, well, in very exceptional cases, they're not going to give you a price for making the most beautiful code. You're not participating in a Google Code challenge or whatever. It's you're making code that is maintainable.
Yeah, for
Remember
other
that.
humans, like you don't have to write minified code yourself. Let the machines minify it.
Yes.
For HTML, I feel like, or I see myself adding comments when like I have maybe an empty div or empty section, and there I'm gonna render something in JavaScript. Maybe I add a comment saying, "Hey, here we will render
Hmm.
the sidebar with
Yeah.
something," or things like that. But yeah, definitely those again are like trimmed or removed from the final build or the final modification of the HTML. So again, no worries in there. So in terms of performance and things like that. Going back a little bit to the CSS, I like when that you separate stuff with comments and stuff. But I think we also need to remind like most junior developers that first work on your selector names, right? I mean, if you just no,
It's
because,
true.
because
True.
when you add like,
True.
I feel sometimes I've seen like variables saying blue, class blue. And that makes no sense, right? Because again, if then the color code is red,
Red.
your class is blue, makes no sense. Or saying it, item. I mean, what? I mean, couldn't you just maybe have notification or have first name or something more semantic that you can just, even if you just look at the HTML, no CSS, you already see more or less what is the CSS doing, right? If you say, I don't know, yeah, a class or a node called name or first name or person, you would imagine more or less what's going on.
And I think you just mentioned something very important, which is semantics. And as they say, semantics is king. And the more semantic you write your code, especially when we're talking about styles, the better. It's going to be easier to read, easier to remember what to be expected. And sometimes I have to say that sometimes I just remember talking about this, that sometimes I add a little bit of code. I don't say if this is that, but I do put a little bit of context also to separate or give me a little bit of breathing air between code. So you can always add a space, but sometimes I add code like that just to help me out, make it more readable. And speaking of readability, let's go to the topic at hand, which is JSDoc. You've worked with JSDocs. Tell us a little bit about what it is and your experience working with it,
And why you should be using it. Um,
and why you should be using it.
so if if your project does not have TypeScript, is the next best thing, because I mean TypeScript already gives you the power of documenting each function param and the return and each variable. I mean, with TypeScript, you will know exactly what everything is, right? But if you're not using TypeScript, I mean, we already talked about it in episode 4. Go back to it. JSDoc helps a lot. I mean, at least for me, I cannot now live without it. It's so we have a function, again, get notifications with 2 parameters, right? And then one would be, I don't know, list, and another would be whatever, a boolean called is shown, right? But you don't know that. You don't know it's a boolean. You don't know it's a list. Okay, the list is what is an array of strings, an array of numbers, an array of objects. You don't know anything. By using JSDoc, which is in the end is just JavaScript comments, you can just add these comments before your function, and it documents each param and it documents each return on a standardized way, so everybody knows how to do it and how to document it. And it helps you because you go to the function, you can read the comment before it, and then you already know what the function expects and what the function will return.
And I think this is just the most basic things that you can do in with JSDoc. There's
Yeah.
a lot of other things that you can add with annotations, but this just adding the type of object
Mhm.
and the purpose of the object, it's quite a bit. Now, there is something that I really love about JSDoc, and it's one of the few things that I like about TypeScript, and it is the autocomplete or the IntelliSense. What can you tell us of your experience working with it, or what it is?
It saves you so much time, man. It's again, I cannot go back to live without it, because when you have all your functions documented, right? Again, with JSDoc or with a little bit of TypeScript here and there, with some types interfaces. When you type whatever notifications dot, you will see already the options. If it's a string, it will give you the options, the functions for a string. If it's an array, you'll have the array functions after it, or the properties of the object, whatever it is. And VS Code and other IDEs are smart enough to understand that, and they help you just code faster, right? So I really not dislike, but I'm very skeptical of developers that say, no, I code with TextMate or Node++ and things like that with no plugins. And I'm like, Sure, you're an excellent developer, but
The brave and the bold.
you're very brave, but no way you are coding fast enough. And then again, if you're building the client, just be honest, use a plugin, go faster, and build them less, right? So
It is one of the things that I missed the most moving from full stack, working with Java and the backend, to going full front end. I remember that was, I guess, one of the biggest struggles, just being able to in Eclipse back then, just starting to type and say period, and then immediately seeing all the relevant options, because you do get by default a lot of options, but seeing all the relevant options. And I'm really, I mean, with VS Code, I've some projects that I've worked with JSDoc. Yeah, you say like the type of value that you are passing is an array, and you are just dot, and immediately the options that you get are those of an array. So it's easier, to work with this. And I think you can take it to a step further, right? For example, if you're passing objects can in classes, well, objects that are based on classes, can you? And this is something that I've seen work, but I don't know if you've worked with it. Have like with JSDoc, let Visual Studio give you more hints about
yeah, yeah,
the
totally. I mean, if you have defined an object, and the way the properties are defined, again, if the function has, I don't know, yeah, called, let's say, list, right? And you say each item of the list is an object, and you have item name, item date, item ID. All those things are defined on the JSDoc. When you're typing inside your function and you do item dot, you will see ID, name, age, whatever it is that you've defined before. So it already is context aware, and it will give you properties available to you. And yeah, and it will also highlight if something is wrong. So let's say that you've defined that this object, yeah, notification, whatever it is, it has only 5 properties, and you type something that it's not there, or just make a typo, right? It was called age, but you type double G, H, whatever it is, and it will put it in red, saying, "Hey, are you sure this is correct? Because it's not defined like this."
and and this is the reason I don't like to use TypeScript, because with tools like JSDoc, you have basically all the things that I need. At least personally, that's
Yep.
a personal choice. And I remember, since we talked about episode 4 TypeScript, I have been working more and more with TypeScript, and I have to say that I got frustrated a few times. Like, but it's basically because of the linter that we have. But yeah.
It's learning again. I mean, I'm with you. I mean, going full TypeScript, it's you never go full TypeScript.
You
It's
never go full TypeScript.
just kidding. Moving on, other types of documentation, Chucho. Would you consider unit testing documentation?
No.
No.
It's a hard no. And I have a very specific reason, and you can change my mind.
Okay.
And this is one of the discussions that we had today in the Slack channel. And because, have you ever tried reading unit tests? They're like super complex in order to actually test some of the features. And you're looking at the code, and it's like, what the hell is this code doing? Where does it go? It's trying to get, they have some a lot of tools just to in order to take to test something that sometimes, in my experience, in my opinion, it looks just too verbose, too complex, too unnecessarily complex.
Okay, we will refer the listeners back to episode 10, unit testing. Go back there and see the fight. Okay, so I'll say for this one, I do consider it a little bit like documentation, in the sense that okay, the function already has JSDoc. The function has maybe a link to a functional specification. But if I go to the unit test, I can see more visually or quickly what's going on. Like I can see, okay, I see this function, we're passing hello world, and it's returning just world. Okay, I see that something is happening. I understand more or less without actually seeing the source that something is happening. And okay, it's not a replacement for documentation, not a replacement for JSDoc or, again, specifications, but it's a plus. So you gain on, okay, the function is robust, and also if you write it correctly and you don't write very obscure and complicated stuff, can help developers also understand edge cases. I think in my case, it's taking edge cases that you. I mean, how do you document everything on a JSDoc? You cannot paragraph or sure, if you go to a wiki, you can write 3 pages on different scenarios. But if you have there in the code, it's maybe it's a little bit faster. I don't know.
Okay, granted that maybe I think, objectively speaking, yes, unit testing is documentation. You're documenting the way that this is done. The important thing is finding a way to actually use it or make it easier. Today we were talking about, it was a small discussion regarding a famous AI tool um, that you passed what you wanted to test, or were the things that you were expecting for the test to be, and then it returned the code. For me, unit testing would be nice, and I think it would be interesting if unit testing was just the first part. When you say, I want to test, and you write a description of what you want to test. When I send this, I want to get this back. When I do this, I want to get this back, blah, 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 blah. And that would be, for me, how unit tests should be. You know, a very human description of what you're expecting there to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I see your point. I see what you're coming from. I do think it's quite English-like. I mean, the functions are called described, it,
Mm, mm.
assert, to be falsy, to be truthy. So more or less, it's very
Yeah.
understandable. But
Yes.
yeah, and with Chat and GTP and Bing now, it's quite amazing. The version 4, it's quite awesome. I was trying it today, and really, just sending it a function, it returned me a bunch of tests, and the other way around as well. If I pass a test, it will give me the function. Not the same as I wrote it, but yeah, we are
And,
good.
and besides this, what other additional, for example, tools to help out with documentation can you think of? Helping creating documentation, or maybe even helping document.
So again, going back to maybe tools for SaaS or for JSDoc as well. I think you can there are tools that where you can generate microsites, right? You can have it in your build, and then it will scan the code, looking for these annotations, this markup, and it will create actually HTML pages with functions and the descriptions, as well as the style guide with the CSS, and that could be also like hosted somewhere, part of your build system, your continuous integration for designers or for other developers to have access to, rather than going to the repository. You already have the documentation available on a site.
Well, one of the tools that for example, talking about AI, Copilot, there's a plugin that I recently got that basically adds additional tools that you can immediately use from there, which include, let me see it so I don't forget. For example, I have it here. To make it more readable, add types, fix bugs, debug, clean, list steps, make it robust, chunk, document, and, well, I think custom theme. I haven't used that one. But the documentation part was interesting. You can select the element. It also has an explain area where you select the function, you see, click on the explain, and it gives you an explanation on what the function is it's supposed to be doing. Sometimes it's good enough, sometimes it's just a little bit obscure. But I like this kind of tools as well, because you can also create unit testing through it. I'm not entirely sure how 100% good it is, but in the end, these are tools not meant, I think, that at least currently, are not meant to substitute, but to enhance the work that we're doing. They're meant for to help us to get started, or to have a starting point from where to proceed.
That's what we want to believe, so we don't get out of the job. No, so I think like mundane jobs like this, like writing documentation, writing unit tests, this will be gone, right? I mean, today we already tried it. Copilot is doing a great job, and I think for some reason it's not as powerful as the Bing GTP examples that they're showing. Maybe Microsoft hasn't yet integrated one with each other, but yeah, definitely writing docs or unit tests with Copilot. Just do it, and now it's easier than never before, right? You just select the function, and it will create a bunch of tests for you. Paste it, move on with your life, and that's fantastic. We will still need people to create like the, how to say it, the bigger picture, right? I mean, I think long past are the days where you had to, okay, how do I don't know, how do I calculate age or something, based on a year or something, right? These things already have Stack Overflow and autocompletes and everything is there. We shouldn't have to spend our time recoding again a function to calculate age. Just give me the function already from this massive repository of models, and just think about the whole architecture. Or so developers need to maybe not go into those kind of jobs, but rather bigger picture, bigger picture again.
Bigger
Pictures,
picture,
take
kind of.
photos of everything. Just
Okay. Oh, and with that, on that note, I think it's time to close. And about, I would like to ask anyone listening to what do you do for documentation? Do you believe in documentation? How much do you document? Just leave a comment and let us know. Thank you, Ricard, very much.
thank you. See you in the next Frontend Coffee Break.
And thank you all for listening in, and see you next time. Bye bye.